We're tonight going to be starting in the book of Genesis, the first book. Now, Genesis gets its name the way all the first 5 books of the Bible get their name. They get their name by what the content is. It describes the content. Of course, the trick is all the words are Greek, so that's not help to most of us if you don't speak Greek. So Genesis, but some of you can probably guess, even if you haven't read ahead, what would you guess Genesis means? Creation, beginning, origins, like genealogy. That's where we get the word. Genealogy is kind of the written out. Origins is what genealogy means. And so the book of Genesis is simply beginnings. Here are some things that begin in Genesis. Light begins, energy, matter, the Earth's ecosystem, all the galaxies begin. Plants, animals, all life begins. Of course, human life begins. The human family is started. Marriage begins. But some bad things also begin. What are some of the bad things? Sin begins. And we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. But we see the birth of music, of craftsmanship is listed in here, of the different people who were the first ones that said God gave them special knowledge and how to do some things. So all these things we see beginning in the book of Genesis. So the book of Genesis means beginning or origin. Now, you can see here in the middle of page 6 that there's an outline, and there's a basic separation. The first part, which it says mankind in general, just refers to before Abraham. So that's everything that happens before Abraham. And then the second part of Genesis begins with Abraham and his ancestors. It's called the Patriarchs, which simply means the fathers of Israel. So there's a lot of discussion when you think about Genesis, right? What do you think about? Creation, the first 2 chapters. And we're not going to focus in this study. You can go find books, volumes of books on, all the ideas about creation, how it happened, how long it all took, and all those sort of things. We're not really going to discuss that in this course. And here's why. Because the Bible doesn't really discuss most of it. For example, to illustrate, years ago we remodeled a house. So I bought all these books on how to remodel a house. And it's more difficult than you think it might be. And so you collect a book on like electrical stuff, then you have to go get a book on plumbing, then you have to get a book on carpentry and a book on roofs after you get a roof leak. Then you got to get a book on, that's how I am, I get a book for it. So I have a shelf at my house and it has thousands of pages of information on how to remodel or how to build a house. And it's still not exhaustive, right? So in thousands of pages just to build one house or remodel one house. Now, how many pages would it take to describe how to build a universe? If it takes thousands of pages how to build a house. So how many pages does God give us? 2. So I don't think his intent was to give us a technical understanding of how he created the world, because he doesn't intend to do this. But what he does is he gives us kind of a basic outline, a general idea, but the message is really about who made the universe and the purpose of him who made it. So that's really what we're going to focus on. The bottom of page 6, it focuses on the Creator. And the first 4 words of the New Testament are what? Of the Old Testament, are in the beginning, God. See, well, my clicker's not working here. There we go. We're not quite there yet, but I just want to make sure we're working. In the beginning, God. Now, that's a very loaded statement because it says that he is the explanation of how things began. That we talked about last week, that God, through his general revelation, we can understand 2 things. Who can remember the 2 things that we can know about God through creation, through general revelation? We can know 2 things about God, basically. We can know that he's really smart, right? He's very intelligent beyond anything that we can comprehend, because he made this universe, he made cells, he made all these complicated things, and also that he is powerful. Both of those, he's to an extent that we cannot even describe them. And so in the beginning, God. And there are 2 names, we could say 2 primary names that we're going to talk about that are used in the book of Genesis. There are more than this, but these are the 2 primary ones in the whole Old Testament, actually. The first one is Elohim. Now, this is what it looks like. It looks in Hebrew, and I don't know if you know this, but Hebrew, you start on the right and you go to the left, like a lot of Middle Eastern languages. Arabic is the same way, but I've written it out here. So the word Elohim. Now, the word Elohim is just like our word God in English. You can have God talking about the one God, but we also have what we call the small letter gods, right? right? You can use that same word to describe any god. So in the Old Testament, we see it used that way. It describes all of the gods, pagan gods, but then it has a special use referring to the God who is the God who created everything. And so when we see the Bible talking about creation, we see it talking about how God relates to creation, relating to nature, and all those sorts of things. It always is spelled this way in English: capital O, capital G, little o, little d. God. That's the God who created in the beginning. But there's another name, primary name, and this is actually the name that's used the most in the Old Testament, and that is the name Jehovah. Have y'all heard that before? Jehovah? And does anyone know how this is spelled in English? In most English Bibles, probably in all of yours, it's spelled in a special way. Well, it's spelled capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. There's another word that's called Adonai, and Adonai is spelled with lowercase O-R-D. But whenever you see in your Bible capital in all caps, or what's sometimes called small caps, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, it's referring to this name Yahweh or Jehovah. This word is always used when it refers to how God is relating to people. So in the first part of Genesis, when God is creating the universe, when he's creating nature and animals and all those sorts of things, it always uses Elohim. But when it shifts to the story talking about God making man and relating to man and woman, it always uses the word Jehovah. So this is the name of God that refers to the covenant name of God, how he relates to people. So turn on over to page 7. And we're going to look at the 7 days of creation. Now, we talked in the beginning about how we're not going to talk too much about all the time and things, but there's one point here that's important to know. And it's because if you read a lot of books on creation, you're going to see this argument or debate pop up. And this is the word yom. This is another Hebrew word that means day. Y-O-M. And it's spelled in English, it's just day. Now, day can have some other meanings. It can also mean an age. And it also can have some strange meanings related to God, like one day is like 10,000 years, and 10,000 years like a day. And so the point is, we're not sure in Genesis exactly how much time is included in Yom, because, as we're going to see in a moment, time didn't start until day 4. So it's really hard to know, were the first 3 days 24 hours a day? Because there wasn't a sun and a moon things to mark time until day 4. And so I'm just putting that out there to say there's some things we talk about creation, we don't have a technical explanation. So when you go read theories about this, and some people are very adamant that I'm right about this, but what I would suggest to you is there's actually a spectrum of ideas that are right, and we're going to talk about it, not going to talk about those in this, but that they're all relatively rated, evolve around this name, or revolve around this word yom, which means day. And some people, one other thing we'll talk about, is have an issue with age in creation. So, for example, this example that's given here is, how old do you think Adam and Eve were when they were created? Do you think they were like newborns? That probably not how most people imagined it, right? You would think he was probably, I don't know, it says 35 here. I guess I imagine more like 20 or something. I don't know, maybe 17. But you imagine him as a full-grown man, because as soon as he's created, he has work to do. He has things that he has to do, things he has to go about. So if you would be able to go back in time and meet Adam, you would never guess that he was just created yesterday, right? By looking at him. Even if you took scientists and you examined them, they would never say, this full-grown man is 1 day old. So the point is that anytime something is created, it always looks like it has age. For another example, move to the New Testament. Every miracle is like this, by the way. Think about Jesus feeding 5,000 people. Fed 5,000 people, and he had a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And out of that, he fed 5,000 people. So where did all the fish come from? Where they were just created out of nothing. So if you were able to go back in time and take one of those fish, by the way, it's kind of like a tilapia is what they eat out of the Sea of Galilee. They had all these tilapia. Those fish that they were eating were cooked, ready to eat, dried. They were full grown because they had to have meat on them. Yet, they were never minnows. They were never in the water. They were never eggs. They never went through the normal, natural processes that a fish would go through. So if you had looked at one of those fish, you would have thought what? This fish is probably a couple years. I don't know much about fish, but you wouldn't think it's 15 minutes old, right? So the point is this: anytime something is created out of nothing, it always has an appearance of being older than it is. So there's a couple of principles we just want to throw out when you read this, because you'll see a lot of different opinions and statements about that. But these are the two things you have to keep in mind. Number one, Genesis does not give us a technical explanation. It gives us an idea. It gives us a pattern. Also, this word yom has different meanings, 24 hours sometimes more than that. And the third one is, anytime something is created out of nothing, it always looks like it's older than it is. Okay, so let's look at the days of creation with that in mind. The first day, in the beginning, God said, let there be what? Light. Let there be light, and there was light. Then the second day, what did God create? The firmament, or the sky, or the heavens. And also he created the water. We see the waters there. And he created the separation, it says, the water. So we see the creation of the sky, and we see the creation of the seas, or the waters that were underneath the sky. And then day 3, we see something created. It's in your book there. We see dry land appear that comes up. And then also there's plants that are created on the dry land. And then on day 4, and by the way, if you want to make a little arrow in your book, I would suggest you do that from first day to fourth day, because here's an interesting pattern how it's set up. The first 3 days sort of builds an environment. The second 3 days fills up that environment. So day 1, he creates light. And then on day 4, he creates the bodies of light. That's what I was talking about earlier, that the bodies of light, the moon, the sun, the stars, and it says those were created for time, for season, for dates, and for those things to be measured, but those didn't come into being until day 4. So you had light for 3 days before you had a 24-hour day. There couldn't have been a 24-hour day before there was a sun and a moon. That's what we're talking about with this day Yom, why there's some flexibility there when we look at that. The fifth day, what is the second day again? We have it up here, sky and water. And what did they make on the 5th day? What fills up the sky and the water? Birds and fish, right? So on the second day, we see the creation of the skies, the heavens. We see the creation of the sea, the waters. And then on the 5th day, we see the creatures that went into those environments, the sea animals and the birds. And on the 3rd day, we have land and plants. And then what is created? What was your guess on the 6th day? You have it written there. Everything that fills up the land, the people, of course, and all the animals that lived on the land. And then something special happens on the 7th day. What happens on the 7th day? God rested from his creation. And he makes a very interesting declaration. He says, he looks at that creation. By the way, in that first verses, he says 6 times he says, and he looked at it, it was good. And then after it was completed, the 7th time he said he looked at it and saw that it was very good. Now what does this mean for it to be good? This is not in your book. I'm just giving you a little bit more free stuff here. When something is good, if I say this is a good pencil, what do I mean when I say it's a good pencil? It works. Yeah, it means that it's well made for its designed purpose. So it means it's well made, it functions for its designed purpose. I don't mean it's good for, what we do in junior high, you do the game like it's not necessarily good for that. But it is, if I say it's a good pencil, it means it is well made for its intended purpose. So when we see that in the Old Testament at the end of creation, when God says it's very good, what he's saying is what I have created is well made for my intended purpose. And that's important because as we come to Genesis 3, something is going to happen that breaks that order, that good purpose. In Genesis 3, remember in Genesis 1 and 2, we have the creation of man, we have the establishment of mankind, and then I have 2 verses I want to have, and you can write these in your book that are very important. Of course, God rested on the 7th day. These are very important verses, especially in our day and age. I watched a debate or sort of a workshop at a university online the other day. And the question was this: what does it mean to be human? And you know what my conclusion was after watching all these secular academics? They have no idea what it means to be a human. That's a problem. Why is that a problem? Because we're for human rights. But then they go, but we can't really define what does it mean to be a human. Well, as Christians, as people who believe the Bible, guess what? We know exactly what it means to be a human. Here are the first two verses we see in the first chapter of the Bible. It says, So God created man, that's mankind, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. This is the essence. What does it mean to be human? Why do we have a such thing as human rights? We have them because human beings are special from the creation, because God breathed life, and then he put his image onto human beings. That's where our value comes from. Your value doesn't come from your achievements, from your intellect or anything. The value of a human being comes from the fact that God has put his image onto people. And that's why wherever you go in the world, when you meet a person, you should love them as your neighbor, because they are made in the image of God. And then it says, here at the end, it says that you should subdue the earth, and it builds on that a little bit in Genesis 2:15. You can jot this down too. Have you ever wondered what was God's first stated purpose for mankind? It's right here. So the Lord God took the man and the woman, of course, and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it, which means to cultivate it, to be productive, to be fruitful. And the second thing says to keep it, which means to preserve it or take care of it. So if you don't know what the essence, the most basic essence of what it means to be a human being, it means you were created by God, you were put on this earth, given stewardship of the earth, and your role, most basic role, is to be productive, to be fruitful, to take care of your family, to help other people, and to preserve the creation that God has given us. So you could go to that academic debate now, and you could just inform all those PhDs what it means to be a human. That's exactly right. Okay, so now, Genesis 3. We see the change in things. We see, and it's broken down. We're going to move quickly. The first part of chapter 3, he has it divided up into 5 parts. The temptation. And here we see that God is not the creator of sin, nor does he tempt men to sin. And that's explained more in the New Testament. But temptation is the work of Satan. Now, we don't find out until later in the Bible who Satan is. Matter of fact, we find out a lot in Revelation. But we know this. We don't know all the details. Again, it's mysterious, but we do know this, that even before mankind was created, God made spiritual beings that we call angels that worked for God. They have different sort of jobs. Some were warriors, some were messengers, some worked in his around his throne. They had different jobs. But sometime, we don't know all the details, but we do know there was a rebellion among those angels against God. And the leader of that rebellion's name was Satan, is what we call him. And Satan simply means the adversary of God. So when we see temptation and sin into the world, it originates from having that free choice, that option of whether to follow God or not, that began with angels, and now we're going to see it grow up among people, where God doesn't want us to be automatons or robots, that he puts us in an environment where we choose to follow him. So he's not the originator of sin. And of course, we know the story. Eve was standing with her husband, whose name was what? Adam. And by the way, Adam just means the man, and Eve just means mother. That's all they mean. And it says that they yielded to the temptation. Satan came to him and he said, if you will rebel against God like me, you will disobey him, then you will be gods yourself. And it says that they listened to that temptation. They listened to that. They looked at the fruit. They desired it because it looked good for food, and they ate it. And it says the moment that they did that, the word that you've heard, it says here that they fell. And it's often called the fall of man, but there's a better word, that they died. They spiritually died, because death means separation. And so at that moment, mankind spiritually died, which means they were separated from God. And the purpose in which they lived, that relationship, was broken. And you can see there in point number 3, that's the result. Immediately it says their eyes were opened in the Old Testament, and there was a loss of innocence. There was a loss of their relationship with God. And you remember what the first thing they did was? They went and sewed together something. What did they sew together? Some leaves for clothes, because they never even realized that they were naked. And then they went and they hid from God. And then an interesting thing happens. God calls out to Adam. Adam kind of scurries out with his leaves wrapped around him. And he said, why are you hiding from me? And Adam says this. What? It was the woman. that you gave me. So who is he really blaming? He was blaming God. It was the woman that you gave me. She gave me the fruit and I ate of it. So God turned to Eve. And he said, Eve, what have you done? And she said what? It was the serpent. He deceived me. And I ate. And then the curses began. And then we see in Genesis 3:15. I think I put this up here. Yes, I did. You need to jot this down. This is the first mention of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and it began the moment after the fall. That's the kind of God, the character of God that he has, is that at the very moment after the fall, we see the promise that God is going to restore it. It says, I will put enmity, and I just define that in parentheses, means make enemies between you, that is the woman, and her, and Satan, and between your offspring and her offspring. And he, this coming one, this Messiah, shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so we see this picture. It's very mysterious. No one knows really what it means. What in the world does that mean? As a matter of fact, no one knew what it would mean for thousands of years. It was a mystery that was revealed in the New Testament when Jesus Christ came. And then we have the promise of the Redeemer, and then everything falls apart. Now, does it take long for people to start doing bad things? How long did it take for the first murder? Not long. You remember? The first murder was Cain killing Abel. In the first generation, the older brother killed the younger brother. And then everything continues to fall apart. So you see the growth as mankind grew in number. Sin also grew in number. And this death, this distance, this separation between God and man grew and grew and grew. And it got to the point where God said, I wish I had never created mankind, because it was such a failure. He said there was immorality and violence. And by the way, those two things always go together. Immorality and violence always are like train tracks. They travel together. And the world was filled with violence and immorality. But then he looked down and he saw one man by which he would display his mercy to that man and to his family. What was the name of that man? Noah. That's exactly right. And then from chapters 5 to 10 in Genesis, we have the story, the first expression of God's justice being displayed, but also God's mercy. His justice is displayed in that he wipes out all the animals and all the people whom he has created. Yet, in an ark, he saves a remnant of the people. Not because they deserved it, but because of his mercy, he did that. And it says, interestingly, in the New Testament, that when Jesus comes again, the circumstances are going to be very similar. You see there, Matthew 24:37 through 39. It begins by saying, when the Son of Man comes, that's Jesus returns, it will be just like the days of Noah. This is what it'll be like. Before the flood, people were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until Noah entered the ark. It was business as usual. And no one paid any attention to the preaching of Noah. And Noah, by the way, preached for 100 years. So, we have that cleansing of the earth. By the mercy of God, the family of Noah was restored. And if you know the story, it didn't take Noah's family long to get off the tracks as well. Sin came up again very quickly. And then we see them grow. But God tells the family of Noah, his command to them is similar to the first one he gave to Adam and Eve. He said, I want you to fill the earth, to spread out and fill up the earth. I've given you the earth. I want you to be stewards of it and take care of. But then we see in Genesis chapter 11, 1 through 4, we see that they didn't want to obey. Let's see what they wanted to do. It says they built a tower to the sky so that they would not spread out. They said, let's get together and all work together and build this huge tower to the sky, make a name for us, otherwise we might spread out. So we see again a community-wide, almost nationwide rebellion against God. They didn't spread out. And what was the tower called? The Tower of Babel. And Babel, as you'll see there at the bottom of page 8, means confusion. That's all it means. It's the place where God confused the languages of the people. So that brings us to the end of chapter 11. Now at the end of chapter 12, remember this is sort of a new page in the history of Genesis, starting at chapter 12. When we are introduced to a man named Abraham, but he's not named Abraham in the beginning. What's he named in the beginning? Abram. That's right. He's just named Abram. And Abram, of course, was one of these pagans. He lived in a city called Ur. And by the way, to go back again to how we have to be careful about how we talk about these things, did you know until the early 20th century, the academics would all say Ur was a mythological place and Abraham was a mythical person. And then they made a discovery in southeast Iraq. And guess what they discovered? The city of Ur. They discovered the city of Ur. And so they thought, oh, well, it must not be mythological since we found it. And so we have Abraham, who's from the city of Ur, and God gives him many promises. But he basically says, I want you to follow me to a place that I will show you. And so Abram later became Abraham, and his wife Sarah followed him along with their nephew Lot. And then God in 12:2-3 makes a promise to Abraham. And I'm going to read this, Genesis 12:2-3. The sort of summarized answer will be up here, but I'm going to read the full passage. Genesis 12:2-3. This is also, if you don't have this marked in your Bible, one of the most important passages in Genesis. Genesis 12:2-3. I'm going to read from verse 1. Actually, it says, Now the Lord came to Abram, and he said, Go forth, or leave your country, and leave your relatives from your father's house, and go to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And how many kids did Abram have at this point in time? 0, right? None. So I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And so shall you be a blessing to other people. And I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And here is the promise again. And to all the families, and in you, or from you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And they became known as the Hebrew people, which eventually became known as the Israelite people. Remember last week we talked about God's special revelation? One of the ways through which God blessed all the families of the earth is that every word that is in God's special revelation was written from a Hebrew hand. They're the ones who recorded God's chosen people. Through them, God delivered His special revelation to the world. And of course, eventually He would send the Messiah. So now, Abram has a son. How old was he when he has a son? Who can remember? 100 years old. And how old was his wife? 90 years old. That's exactly right. And now Isaac, you'll see, if you see the letter B on the page 9, he gets a lot of chapters. He has 6 chapters in the book of Genesis, yet most people don't talk about him too much because his life, compared to his dad and compared to his son, was pretty boring. But he did have a son. And he had actually 2 sons, twins. Who can remember the name of the 2 twins of Isaac? Esau and Jacob. And later on, God would change Jacob's name. And what would He change it to? Israel. He would change Jacob's name to Israel. And the meaning of Israel, this is very important. Names in the Bible are very important. I don't think this is actually here in your book. If you want to write this down. The name Israel means he who struggles with God. That is the meaning of the name Israel. And of course, that lays the foundation for all of the Israelite people. They are the people, God's chosen people. And you will see generation after generation after generation, the people who are struggling with God. So Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, had 12 sons. And those 12 sons became the father of the 12 tribes. And I'm going to put those up here so you can fill in your blanks. You have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and the baby boy, Benjamin. That's exactly right. And of course, these became the heads of the tribes. There was a little bit of adjustment. We're not going to go into that because of some decisions that were made. And Joseph's sons actually end up replacing one of them. But the most important tribe in the history in the rest of the Old Testament is the tribe of Judah. Here's what it says in Genesis 49:10. I think I have it up here. Well, it has here that Jesus came, of course, through the tribe of Judah. I thought I put the verse up here. Did I not? No, I didn't. Let me go back. Basically, let me read 49:10. I'm just going to read it real quickly. If you have your Bible, you can turn there as well. In Genesis 49:10, the blessing that came to Judah. (49:10) says this about Judah and his descendants. It said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." Now, eventually, the first king came from the tribe of Benjamin, first king of Israel, whose name was Saul. And then the second king, though, came from the tribe of Judah. And who knows the name of that king, very famous king? King David. And so he came from that tribe. And then, of course, this is how important it is. Now, they're not called Israelites today. What are people who are Israelites? What are they called today? Jewish people. The reason they're called Jewish people, or in other languages called Judah, is because all of the descendants here, eventually the 10 tribes get carried off into exile and get lost, and the only two left are Benjamin and Judah, but the Benjamites get wiped out at some point, and they merge more or less with Judah. So all Jewish people can trace their lineage back to Judah, and that's why they're called Jews. Okay, now I have a little bit of homework for you this week. Okay, and this is your homework, part D. Most of the Bible, not most, but a huge part of the book of Genesis is about the life of Joseph. Now, Joseph was son named number 11. And let's sketch his life real quick, but you're going to answer this last page as homework. You're going to explain how the life of Joseph reveals the supremacy of God and his care for his own. Now, Joseph is a very famous character, and it's a wonderful, wonderful story. And Joseph, you'll remember, his brothers just loved him, didn't he? He was like the favorite son of all. He was the favorite brother of all of them, wasn't he? No, he was hated by his brothers. Now, why was he hated? Because there was wonderful parenting going on, right? There was some dysfunctional parenting going on, some sinful type of parenting, and he was the favorite of his father. And so his father would do special things from him, and all the older brothers were out working in the fields, and Joseph, because he was the baby boy at that time, before Benjamin was born, he was given special favors. And so his father gave him a beautiful gift. Who can remember the gift he gave him? The coat of many colors. And what was Joseph's first thought? I'm going to go show my brothers this wonderful coat that I've been given. And so his brothers weren't happy about that coat. And then he also had a couple of dreams. And in those dreams, which he told his brothers, basically I'll give you the interpretation. He dreamed that all of you are going to bow down to me one day, brothers. Don't you think that just, if you're an older brother and you have a younger brother, that's just what you want to hear, right? And so Joseph, of course, his father sends him out to find them. He goes and he finds his brothers. But what do? They've been plotting. They hate him so much. It's been just brewing and brewing. They said, we're going to get rid of this brother. And so first they have a debate, and they were going to kill him at first, and then they decide not to. They throw him in a well, and then they pick him up. And I just can't imagine what they did next. What did they do? They sold their baby brother to Ishmaelites. We'll not talk about Ishmaelite traders who were on their way to Egypt. They sold their younger brother into slavery, hoping they would never see him again. And then they concocted a lie that they would keep for decades. And the lie was what? That he got killed by an animal. They took his wonderful coat that he liked to show off, and they tore it up, and they put goat's blood on it, and they took it to their father and said, "Oh, Father, our brother Joseph has been killed by an animal." But of course, Joseph ends up in Egypt, right? And Joseph, we see the wonderful practical things of living in God's will. First of all, does Joseph has an easy time? Now, God loves Joseph. God's going to use Joseph, and yet Joseph is a slave. And then he ends up where? In prison for years. And he's falsely accused, by the way. He works hard. He's honest. He's doing just what God wants him to do. He becomes a slave. And then he comes to jail. But God remembers him, eventually brings him out, and God blesses him in the end, raises him up until finally he becomes the equivalent of the prime minister of Egypt. after he has the Pharaoh has a dream, and Joseph says there's going to be a famine, and he saw how good of an administrator Joseph was. So then he puts Joseph in charge of all the collecting of crops to store it up for 7 years so they would be ready for the famine. So he did 7 years, wonderful crops. They stored it all up. Then the 8th year, something started. A famine started. And it wasn't just in Egypt, it was also up where his brothers lived. Now his brothers thought he's long gone. We're never going to see him again. And so his brothers, the famine strikes their family, and father Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel, sends the oldest brothers. But there's been another brother born by this point, right? Benjamin, the youngest brother, is born. Joseph didn't even know. And they were full brothers. The rest were just half brothers. So the oldest 10 brothers come down to Egypt. And boy, Joseph saw them. And I can't imagine what he was thinking when he saw all the brothers. But of course, I don't know if you've seen those pictures of the pharaohs. They wore makeup and hats and all these sort of things, almost like a disguise so that people would respect him. So his brothers didn't recognize him. But he could understand. They were talking in Hebrew, and they had no idea that what? Oh, he knew what they were saying. And he, of course, went through some interesting kind of ways to trick his brothers and to bring up. But eventually, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And it said he just broke down in tears and had them bring his younger brother. And then he makes one of the most famous and important statements at the end of Genesis. He says, "You intended, my brothers, you intended all this for evil, for me. But God has intended it for good." And so if you're going through difficult times, it's not because God doesn't love you. God uses difficulty and suffering, which of course we're going to see it ultimately come out through the life of Jesus Christ, his son. But we see already in Genesis, in the origins, we're seeing this: God is merciful, God is just. And we're seeing that God uses difficulties of his people to bring about his will and his purpose. And we're going to follow for the rest of this Bible, this family of Hebrews, the Israelite people, to see how they do. Okay, we're going to end there, and we're going to begin our question and answer if there's any questions.